Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you all for joining us. With us today, special treat, Bryan Alexander, adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Bryan is an internationally known futurist, researcher, writer, speaker, consultant, and teacher working in the field of how technology transforms education. He completed his English language and literature PhD at the University of Michigan in 1997 with a dissertation on doppelgangers in romantic era fiction and poetry. Then Bryan taught literature, writing, multimedia, and information technology studies at Centenary College of Louisiana. There, he also pioneered multi-campus interdisciplinary classes while organizing an informational literacy initiative. Now he teaches at Georgetown University, very prestigious school. He's an adjunct professor there. But this was the article we wanted to talk to him about, was The Big Sort, Fine, but Not Fine Enough, written in 2017. Professor, did I get anything wrong with your background or your introduction?
No, it's good. I would just mention that I'm a senior scholar at Georgetown, and that my most recent book is about climate change and the future of higher education. It's called Universities on Fire. It just came out a few weeks ago, and it's visible right over my left shoulder.
Okay, and I love the backdrop. I love it when people come on and then they have just all these wall of books behind them. Somebody had they put themselves in the corner. So like you had the books and they looked like they were coming at you 3D. That was pretty cool. So we are interviewing with Bryan Alexander, senior scholar, professor at Georgetown University. Let's start off. Why did you write an essay about the Big Sort in 2017? What is the Big Sort? Why is it important? Why did you think it was important to write this essay 6 years ago? What was going on?
Well, what is the Big Sort? This is Bill Bishop's book, where he takes a look at how he sees America sifting out into the self-reinforcing divides, more or less red versus blue in the classic CNN color scheme. And I'd been hearing about this. It made a lot of attention. I'd seen references to it, and I thought, okay, I should dive into it. I'm a futurist. My specialty is the future of higher education. That's what I research and work on. And in order to do that work, I have to have a good glimpse of the future of the entire world, because higher education is so intertwined with it. And so I look at a lot of things. I mean, I look at geopolitics, I look at macroeconomics, I look at a lot of technology, but sociology is very, very important. And looking at how the United States changes, for me, is very important. I'm a U.S. citizen. A lot of my clients are in the U.S., but also for higher education, American higher education is globally very important. We're about a quarter or a fifth of the entire population of colleges and universities around the world, and we're way more influential than that. We're a major destination for study. We publish a lot of research, and our pedagogy is a model for a lot of places around the world. So I thought, okay, let's see what's happening in the United States. Let's see what the Big Sort is about, and let's see how that might impact higher education. So I read the book. I was very interested by it. I did not really think about it much in terms of the then recent spectacular Trump election. A little bit, but not too much. And in particular, because Bishop was talking about a long-running trend, something that had been going on for a generation or two. And I thought overall the idea was pretty convincing. It tied together with a few different things I'd observed. There's an interesting book by Robert Putnam and a research team.
Bowling Alone?
No, that book actually disappointed me. No, it's called Our Kids. And to give you a sense of just how history changes, he published that in 2016, and he was really hoping to get a conversation going among national politicians about that. And his argument was basically that America is rapidly becoming more and more economically unequal, and that inequality was shaping, among other things, the experience of kids, and that children were growing up in increasingly different circumstances, which is a bad thing. That is, more and more kids are growing up in schools that are economically marginal, that marginalize kids in terms of their life choices and second chances, that pushes them away from higher education, while you have other schools that are just accelerating away from those, that have richer pedagogies, they have far more opportunities, and they're a great supply chain right into higher education and to better paying jobs. And Putnam thought this was a big deal, and this was relatively recent historically. He dated back to the 1980s, if I recall. He talked longingly about his childhood in northern Ohio, where he thought, in his vision, and he's a sociologist of some repute. So, I mean, he's not just making this up. Right? He
Right.
thought that when he was growing up in the 60s and 50s, I may have the dates a little off here. It's been a while since I read it, but the populations were more integrated, that wealthy and poor people were not physically separated as they are now. And he wanted to draw attention to this. And so when the book came out, it made a lot of attention. It got covered on NPR and places, but the 2016 election went in completely different directions instead, and we haven't come back to that topic. So I thought, okay, Big Sort sounds a lot like our kids, but Bishop's idea is a little different. He does include economic sorting, but he also thinks that we are sorting more for what he calls non-economic purposes, more the culture war. So if you're a very religious person and you think religion matters to your conduct in life, and you'd like to see more religion in the public square, then you're more likely to move to a place where other people feel the same way. And it's probably not going to be San Francisco or Austin, Texas, or New York City. If you are someone who believes that LGBTQ plus rights are very, very important, maybe that describes your identity, and you want to be among more people like this, and you are more likely to move to a place like San Francisco or New York City. And this becomes self-reinforcing. And then this loop just, everyone who lives in a place that is more conservative, more red, in the red-blue dynamic, you tend to want to stay there, and you attract more people there. And the people who are blue in that area feel increasingly isolated, and they want to move out to other places. That sounds kind of simple, but his vision is not that it would be as simple as, say, what happened to the US in 1860. You wouldn't have two clearly distinct countries, that there's a lot of intertwining. So I mentioned Austin, so you think about that as a blue island in a red sea.
Right.
But you can also think about conservative swaths of New York State, alongside the very blue New York City. So I thought this was fascinating, and it had a lot to recommend. I had some criticisms of it, but I've been talking too long, Marcus. Does this make sense, what I've said so far?
It makes sense. And the way I like to do it is I like to let people explain on their own before I get to the questions, so that I can develop trust and people can say, you didn't put words in my mouth. I didn't get a chance to say what you put. So I always start off with, what are you saying? Why did you do this in your words? Because sometimes I pick it apart, sometimes I don't, but I want everybody to feel like, hey, I got to say my piece how I wanted it to be said, and it was received by the audience.
Sure.
Let's start off with the basics. And I have the essay here. I'd encourage everybody to go read it. You can check it out at his website, bryanalexander.org, The Big Sort, Fine But Not Fine Enough. This essay was written in 2017. It's 6 years later. So I have been doing interviews with professors, scholars, and writers and reporters, and we've been talking about national divorce. Obviously, you heard about Marjorie Taylor Greene on President's Day saying we need a national divorce between red and blue. We can't live together. And so I've been looking at all the polarization research and all the articles written by any academic or any newspaper, or any publication of repute over the last 20 years. Many of them are saying things like, it's social media that made us so polarized. It's gerrymandering that made us so polarized. It's extreme politicians who are making us so polarized. And what I found interesting was that all the people who are saying this are not mentioning The Big Sort, not mentioning the book at all. They want to mention it's social media, elite politicians, or gerrymandering, and then they will have absolutely no mention of The Big Sort at all, or Bill Bishop, or landslide voting counties, or anything like that. And I go, well, that's kind of interesting. You guys are saying, well, the split is here for all these reasons, and yet no discovery of The Big Sort. And then I did some research, and NPR has been consistently reporting about how this is a valid theory for the last 20 years. And after the 20th professor that I talked to had absolutely no idea about the big sort or bishop, or that this had ever been going on, or that this is
Mm.
a pattern that goes back to the 1990s, or that it was covered by the Wall Street Journal and Harvard and New York Times and NPR and Time Magazine, I was like, something's going on here, because I'm reading all the articles. I'm looking at all the studies. It's gerrymandering, elite politicians, social media, no discussion of the big sort. When I'm talking to professors, after I got to the 15th one, who's like, "What's that?" And I had a professor and a writer for the former Washington Post. I showed him the landslide voting counties, where we used to have just a couple landslide voting counties back in the 70s, 60s,
Yeah.
90s. And then now it's almost all of America. I'll pull up
Wow.
that map in a second. So,
Wow.
and he literally goes like this: "I reject that map." I'm like, you've never seen the map before. How can you reject it? So
Yeah.
I'm strong. So my question to you is the big sort real? Does it occur? Is it a worthy theory? Do you still think 6 years later that it's a worthy theory?
I think it is. I think it's a very worthy theory, but I think the problems identified with it still persist. Um, I mean, I think we do see more and more people trying to organize their living relationships according to ideology in various frames of ideology. I mean, ideology might include attitude towards migration, religious beliefs, sexuality, and so on. And there's a long tradition of that in America. Especially in the 19th century, a lot of people would form intentional communities to try and have like-minded neighbors and to live and work with them. Um, but I think it's pretty clear from the last couple of elections and the results that state and local politics are becoming very, very intense this way. So, for example, we're seeing more and more very Republican states pushing a whole series of interesting laws, including laws about trans minors, laws about books, and so on. And of course, ever since the repeal of Roe versus Wade, we've seen a bunch of very red, deep red states pushing all kinds of very restrictive laws, including some that are just deeply inhumane. And then we see the opposite. We see some deep blue states pushing some, very, very different directions. California is taking a lead on a lot of environmental legislation, really more than anybody else in the U.S., pushing hard on climate change, for example. So I think we'll still see this. Your point about the large number of landslide counties, I think is absolutely right, because we've seen, I think, really since 2000, a lot of the electoral map on the national scale is more or less locked in. A few states have moved around. I mean, back in 2000, Florida was considered a purple state, Virginia considered a red state, and now those have reversed. But I think in many ways, no one's really contesting New York. No one's really contesting Texas. And so we're down to, a small number of states with a large number of flippable counties. And some of those are surprising, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia. But I think already people are talking about 2024 in terms of what the odds are of Trump or Biden capturing those relatively small numbers of states. Um, I think this matters. I'll get into the problems in a second. I think this matters when it comes to higher education, in the sense that campuses for colleges and universities are intertwined with their local community in all kinds of ways. Just economically, campuses rely on the local community for all kinds of stuff: electrical power, food, transportation. And of course, the communities are often beneficially influenced by a local college or university, because those people buy stuff, they buy services, they rent houses, that kind of thing. And then there are also political interchanges. My favorite example was in the 1960s in the town of Carlisle, Pennsylvania. You've got a liberal arts college and you've got a federal military academy, about a mile apart from each other. So
Yeah,
just kind of protest machine that can be
right.
generated there.
Yeah.
Right? But I think there's also the fact that campuses are political creatures in other ways. That if a county or a city is engaged in a political controversy, there's pressure for the university or college to take a stance. And sometimes it works the other way, that the politics on campus can pressure a university leadership to take a public stance. And even if leadership doesn't do anything, that those activities can then become known to the public, and you can have an interchange that way. And technology that's developed further since Big Sword came out makes that even easier and easier to happen. If you're teaching a class in journalism, Marcus, and I'm a student there and I don't like your lectures, it's trivially easy for me to record you in different ways,
Sure.
video, photographs, and get that online.
Sure. But if I may,
Please.
so let me just cover this map, if I may.
Yeah.
This is from the New York Times. But this information, as I said, was backed up by NPR in 2022, NPR in 2017, NPR in 2008. It's also been backed up by there was a couple of the Daily Yonder, I think, was also by Bill Bishop. So anyways, this looks at landslide voting counties. In the top left corner, 1992. In the bottom, 2016. So if you go back to 1992, top left corner, red means don't even run there if you're a Democrat, you have no chance. Blue means don't even run there if you're a Republican, you have no chance. Gray means competitive. We're open, best ideas based upon the situation. Maybe we vote Nixon, maybe we vote Kennedy. And you can see how 1990 all the way down to 2016, almost all the grays wiped out. So we've lost our ability to have competitive elections. And this is a presidential election map by county when they're looking at landslide voting. And basically we've lost competitive election counties. There's a lot of other data. There's also data showing that Americans now, I think it was in 2012, 1/3 of them would say I won't date somebody who doesn't share my politics, and now it's 50%. You could also look at, I think, the American voter survey. After votes, they do a survey of voters, and the number of people who would call themselves moderates has also declined by 100%. So the question I have is, the big sort goes back to 1990. Gerrymandering starts around 2000. That's when it starts to become a problem with the Bush-Gore election. I looked this up. This is what professors are saying. It starts 2000, really gets exacerbated 2010. Social media becomes the polarizing influence and starts becoming affecting elections around 2010, 2015. And extreme politicians that, as we know now, saying all sorts of crazy stuff, really starts after Trump, or towards the second half of Trump's presidency, 2018, 2020. Why then? We have all these authors and all these professors talking about polarization in America, and none of them can bring up the big sort. What they'll say is gerrymandering, social media, or extreme politicians. But the big sort predates all of those. The big sort predates gerrymandering by a decade. It predates social media by 20 years. It predates extreme politicians by 25 years. NPR's covered this multiple times, New York Times, Washington Post. How come basically nobody could mention this at all? And how come basically nobody is clued in, and there is zero discussion about how this theory predates all of these other things, and yet nobody's talking about this at all, and NPR covers it? How do we get such a total lack of awareness or recognition of this theory, and why are people in academia and the media seemingly willing to go to every other possible theory but this one, even though this has been so well documented? That's why I wanted to talk to a professor who's actually looked at this and can explain, because it's hard to talk to professionals who are even aware of this. Why are they not aware of this? It's been out there. Why are they acting like other things could be the culprit when this predates all of them? How come there's a total lack of awareness or mention of this? And that's why I started off with asking you, Professor, is this even a legitimate theory? Does it still hold? And you're like, yeah, it does. Okay, then why is nobody else getting it?
A couple of reasons, and these aren't ones I've tested out, but I'll put these out here just because they seem plausible.
Theories.
Hypotheses.
Hypotheses.
I think one is that we are in the middle of what the British press called the techlash, a huge backlash against Silicon Valley, and you can see this in all kinds of ways. The rise in pop culture of tech bro billionaires as villains, that kind of thing. And I think people really love to lard social media with all kinds of problems. And I could pick that apart in a lot of ways. It's pretty interesting, but that's relatively recent. I mean, social media, you can date it in different ways. Web 2.0 is, roughly 2001, 2002. But I think they just want to see if they want to see that as a major, major cause. Now, if you're thinking about media, you can go back to television and think about the huge split between, say, MSNBC and Fox, which goes further back. But that usually gets left out. People tend not to criticize TV along those lines. So I think the technology obsession is a really big reason. I think the second problem has to do with the big sort succeeding. People have sorted out and increased, especially faculty and researchers. And so, someone's living in San Francisco, if someone's living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, they're more likely to be surrounded with everybody like them. And so, they're less likely to be talking about this stuff. And online, to some extent, the filter bubble theory of Elia Pariser is true. I tend to get certain commercials pushed my way, certain ads pushed my way
Right.
because of who I am. And it takes me in my research, I make sure to follow multiple people of multiple political backgrounds. But I actually get blowback from that. I've had people on Facebook, say, "Well, why do you still allow this person of this ideology to post on your wall at all? Why don't you just block
Mm-hmm.
them?" Right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think there's a kind of recency bias too. I think 2016 really blew up a lot of people politically. I think a lot of Democrats were deeply, deeply invested in Hillary Clinton's campaign and the spectacular disaster of that. I mean, it's really hard to overestimate just what a disaster that was. If you think about the huge press advantage that Clinton had, her enormous war chest, the lockdown on the huge political machine she was able to
Yeah.
mobilize, and then to lose everything, not just the
Yeah.
presidency, but Congress and so many state governments. I think for a lot of Democrats, they saw that became a traumatic incident, and that became where they started thinking from. That was the kind of the meteor, from knocking out the dinosaurs. It was that kind of event, so they'll focus on that, and that's one reason why so many have been on a kind of war footing ever since. And I think Republicans, for them, this cracked open the egg of what they thought they could be. And there's a long running, kind of civil war within the Republicans in different ways, East Coast versus Middle, and all kinds of things. And I think this gave permission for people like Marjorie Taylor Greene to come out, for the kind of cable news style, over the top internet kind of personalities. And that the Republicans have embraced, nonstop ever since, openly lying, telling tall tales, that kind of professional wrestling stance. They've really embraced that. And so I think for a lot of them, 2016, that's where they start. And it's hard to go further back. And to go back to the 1990s, well, I mean, it's for you and I, it's disturbing to think about to what extent that's the ancient past for a lot of people.
True. True. But they have no problem bringing up gerrymandering and saying
Well,
it goes back to 2000. I mean, they're quick to grab that. I totally agree with what you're saying, by the way. There's
but gerrymandering,
presentism, right?
I mean, the thing about gerrymandering is first of all, this is incredibly inside baseball kind of stuff.
Right.
It's really technical.
Right.
It's hard to grasp, and gerrymandering predates the United States. I mean, it's what we've always done in different ways. But so if you want to talk about gerrymandering now, you do have to look at, as you say, 2000, 2010, these big decisions. And if you go further, I mean, even just talking about that, you've lost 90% of the room. If you're going to go further back into the 90s and 80s, it's now you're doing pure historiography.
I hear you. It's just sad that we live in a time where the information arbiters, the experts, the sources to be trusted in the media and in academia, suffer from the same biases as lay people. I didn't like Trump either, too. I kind of got triggered, too. What good are they then? I mean, if you can't separate your bias And this is all I grew up hearing. Oh, I'm a news person. We're trained to separate our bias. Oh, I'm a
Right,
professor. I am trained by academia to separate my
right.
bias. Well, it turns out that, Trump riled them up. That's out the window. What good are they then? Because I thought you guys were supposed to be able to clear cut, look at this, tell us the facts. I mean, professors are called professors because they're supposed to profess. The news was called the fourth or fifth
Mhm.
column of democracy. These are institutions that are supposed to provide the straight and narrow, steak and potatoes as it is. And then I'm hearing from you, and I've heard from many other people. Well, they're humans like the rest of us, and they got whipped up like the rest of us. Well, then
Yeah.
that means we shouldn't be able to hold their word to the same level as we used to, like when Walter Cronkite was around.
And then that's a frightening prospect. And for different people for different purposes, because if I mean, does that then kind of shatter the edifice of social knowledge in the U.S.? Does that make us even more skeptical of news media? I mean, I'm all for that personally. I mean, I believe in deep skepticism,
Right.
but I know for quite a few people, they're worried about the loss of what they think of as a kind of shared truth. You mentioned Walter Cronkite, thinking about that kind of centrist, agreement of stuff. I do a lot of work in climate change, and it's always startling to me to see people coming up with just fantasy versions of reality around climate change. We just came out of the pandemic, and more or less. Definitely a lot less of us. We have 1.1, 1.2 dead, a million dead, right? But the pandemic showed just horrifying examples of people just believing nothing or making stuff up. My wife was working in public health in Virginia County, and she told me about a health food restaurant whose owner and staff refused to get vaccinated because, quote, they were too healthy. And she tried explaining that's not how disease work. That's not how
Right.
the virus works. Um, I think you can see this in journalism. I mean, the big push towards advocacy journalism. You can't be neutral on a moving ship, right? You have to,
Right.
partake. Again, I think for so many people, they see themselves, in a on a war footing, and they don't want to. They're afraid of both sidesism.
I
And
saw that. I saw Lester Holt won the award for journalism, and he said there can't be both sidism. Being a good
Mhm,
journalist means not
mhm,
looking for the other side, not even
mhm.
attempting to do that, just going, oh, this is the right side, and that's what I'm going to tell you. And he literally said that while accepting a journalism award. I think that was like 2 years ago. And, nobody criticized him for that. And I'm like, wow, that's the total opposite of journalism from what Cronkite would have said.
Yeah,
And yet the man
yeah,
is saluted for it. And that just backs up everything you're saying. They're literally going, biased news is the way to do it, folks. I mean, that's what they're just straight up saying it.
yeah.
Um, we have a few minutes left. I want to ask you this question, though.
Sure.
Researchers routinely say, and I've read this many times, oh, the people are not polarized. It's something else. It's the
Mm,
elites. It's the media. It's social this. It's not the public. The public's not polarized. And again, they don't bring up the big sword. They don't bring up this has gone on for 3 decades. They don't bring up the lack of landslide counties. They don't none of this. So are the people not polarized at all? We're still all in it together, where it's kumbaya, no problems, or are the people actually polarized and these maps showing a 3 decade pattern of people moving into hardcore red and hardcore left communities is actually true? Because I'm seeing academic researchers say, no, 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 no. There's no polarization amongst the public. Here's something else. And yet it flies in the face of these maps. So who should I believe?
Well, I think this brings me to a couple of my criticisms of Bishop,
Sure.
and one of them is that, and I don't mean this as a criticism of his work, which I think is groundbreaking, but is that it's too simple. Red and blue is too enormously simplified for describing a nation of what do we have? 332 million people, excuse me, with and Americans are terrific at generating all kinds of ideas and positions, just about everything. I mean, if you look at red and blue, you're talking about these two check marks every two Novembers in a row. And that really does simplify things, and all kinds of things fall out of that. The real unanimity that we get in practical terms for foreign policy just kind of disappears there. You think about the things that hit us obliquely in terms of red versus blue. Cannabis legalization, for example, which sometimes follows red versus blue, sometimes does not. And that's, of course, changed our society right now and still is. And we're looking for more of that to come. That doesn't quite fit in. And you don't see people, the divisions within red and blue. You don't see the libertarian versus the theocrat on the Republican side. You don't see the Clintonian center neoliberal part of the Democrats versus the AOC Bernie Sanders Elizabeth Warren left. And you don't see just the sheer complexity of life, but also you don't see the fact that we tend to get along. Our crime rate during the big sort plummeted. It's gone up the past couple of years, and people are still arguing about what that means, but it's nowhere near where it was in the 80s and 90s. We hyperventilate about it a lot. I diss TV news all the time, and this is one of the reasons, is that TV news, more than anywhere else, just pumps up every bit of crime it can. It bleeds, it leads. That's their motto, right?
Sure.
That's from local TV through big, national outfits like CNN. And yet our crime rate is actually just dropped. And we don't recognize that. We don't celebrate that as we should, or look at the causes. How did that happen? What did we learn from this, right?
Sure.
It's possible that we're about to engage in a low-level civil war, perhaps along the lines, say, of the years of silver and lead in Italy in the 60s and 70s.
Plato Pomo.
Yeah,
Yes.
yes. Do we see that kind of thing, or something like what happened in Ireland during the Troubles, or Plato or Plumbo, thinking about Mexico and thinking about, not a civil war per se, but the war on drugs, corruption, nightmare there. Maybe we'll head into this. Last year we saw some really interesting attacks on electrical power stations. We see more and more creative uses of the internet. Perhaps we're gonna see more shootings that start to take on a political cast right now, but we might not. We do tend to, often get along and yell at each other, but live together. So I mean, right now, those are a couple of the criticisms I would have, and a couple of the limitations I would have for this theory. The other thing to keep in mind, if I could, just one more point,
Please.
is, and maybe this is one reason people don't cite Bishop. Bishop is talking about a great division, but what he tends to miss or downplay is the homogeneity in American culture. We've got all kinds of personalization. We have all kinds of minute differences, county by county, town by town, person by person. But also we have a lot of forces that are just uniform or just sift throughout the U.S. You think about chain stores, for example. You think about certain types of products, the loathsomeness that is American cheese, for example, or some of the inherited beers. We have big avenues of homogeneity that just work through American culture.
Sure.
And I don't celebrate those very much. But I think a lot of people in practice do. You go to a new town and you're lucky. Oh, there's a Quiznos or Pep Boys, and you think, I know what that is. That's reliable.
Absolutely there is. Everybody watches football and likes
Right.
Coors Light or Bud Light, etc. Like, there's a national culture. Absolutely. But there's also, we could say that the English-speaking countries, the 5 that are separate countries, have a common culture too. There's a love of cricket and the Queen, and yet they're 5 separate nations. When I see people talk about how the public itself, and yes, Bill Bishop looked at, and I read some of the criticism of Bishop's work, looking at Professor Fiorina's article on the big sort that wasn't. But even Fiorina admitted the sorting's happening. He just disagreed that Bill Bishop could look at just presidential elections by counties and say this gigantic divergence into blue and red is true based upon this only data set. And you're kind of hinting at the same thing too. The issue that I have is that there are other data sets that buttress it. So here's Wall Street Journal 2020. You can look at this map.
Yeah.
1974, the amount of people identified as hardcore conservative were 45%.
Mm,
In 2016,
mm,
it was 76%. 1974, the amount of people who identified as hardcore liberal was 28%. 2016, it was 59%. If you look at this chart, it's a straight line until roughly the 90s,
mm-hmm,
and then it
mm-hmm,
starts expanding.
mm-hmm.
This absolutely backs up Bishop's work. There's a
It
bump in
does.
the 90s, and then it goes up, and this shows the people are sorting themselves. There's also this chart showing how the average Democrat and the average Republican have changed their opinion
Hmm.
from 95 to 2015. So it was, I don't know, under 25%, 95, and then it's now over 40%. Democrats who view the Republican Party poorly, it was about 26, 27%. Now it's up to 30. So that's between 95 and 15. That's another data source from another sort, not Bill Bishop. There's also other people have Bloomberg, The Atlantic, 538 have all looked this up. The Cook
Mm-hmm,
Report has backed this
mm-hmm.
up too. This is one of my favorite ones, and this is from Time Magazine. People
Yeah.
don't date each other. So about a third in 2012 to more than half in 2020 won't date someone who's not of their political beliefs. Then we can also look at the amount of distrust of Americans has risen. Partisan divide on political issues grows even wider. This one is going back to 1994 up to 2017.
Looks like a Pew Research.
Yeah, Pew Research, absolutely. And what they were showing is the amount of divergence on race, religion, school attendance, education, age, gender, kind of flatlined. But the difference on politics, more than double. And it's the only one, 1994 to 2017. That's not Bishop data, and it backs up Bishop. So we have other data sources from Wall Street Journal, Pew, Time Magazine, looking from 1990 to 2016, that show the people themselves are being polarized. One of my favorite ones, if I can find it, was a study, and yeah, it was taken during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
But it was here. New initiative explores deep, persistent divides between Biden and Trump voters. This is at the University of Virginia, Sabato Crystal Ball Center, pretty good
Mm-hmm.
place. September 30th, 2021. Yeah, it's during COVID. I get it. But 80% of Biden voters, I'm sorry, no, this is my favorite here.
Okay.
74% of Biden voters and 78% of Trump voters feel voters from the other party are a clear and present danger to the USA, language typically reserved for an ISIL attack or a Russian nuclear strike.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When we add this all up, and you can go, oh, that's COVID, that was a bad year, people are upset. Okay, but what about the dating? What about the other metrics that kind of show people are, they're getting polarized, they're sorting themselves out? Can we say that this is not a problem caused by the people themselves that goes back 3 decades?
Well, now it's becoming chicken and egg, right? As it continues to cycle. I think the dating part, if I could, I think there's two factors there that are just critical, and the data that you're looking at predates the Dobbs decision mostly. I think the Dobbs decision is just accelerating this, and it's interesting to see how this might play out. I'm hearing a lot of reports that Trump is urging Republicans to downplay abortion and to pull back on abortion regulations because it's polling so badly. I mean, traditionally in America, you've got about 1/3 of Americans who are pro-life, 1/3 who are pro-choice, 1/3 somewhere in the middle. And the extreme laws that are put into place right now are basically only appealing to the 1/3, that are strongly pro-life. And they're losing the other 2/3. So it's possible we're going to see this blow up in their faces. But when it comes to dating, now this is an immediate matter. This is a material question. If you're dating somebody, what they think about abortion is now something that matters right now, tonight. I mean, I'm seeing and hearing all kinds of stories of women swearing off dating for until Dobbs is replaced by say a congressional law or something. But I think that's one reason for the dating. The other, and this is really interesting. This is one that's we're just I've researched for a long time, and we're just starting to feel our way around, which has to do with the demographic transition. That you and I grew up thinking about overpopulation being the great problem, and it turns out that in the developed world and increasingly in the developing world, that the opposite is where we're headed instead. If the
Right.
U.S. didn't have so much migration, we'd be plateaued, if not shrinking. And so,
Thank you. As a Latino, I want to say thank you.
yeah,
Thank you.
well,
Thank you.
Latinos are
He
the
said
biggest,
it. See, I'm not the only one saying it. He
right?
said it. Okay.
Right. Well, you guys are also the biggest population in the U.S. after white population, and you're the biggest one that's growing still. And well, I don't want to get off track because and I can say right now, ahora yo estudio español. Hablo un poco. But the key fact I think is that more and more people are getting more nervous about the number of children being born, and this may play out in red versus blue terrain. So you may get more red people pushing for more children, and blue people not wanting that, which again comes to dating, right?
True.
Are you going to
True.
use birth control? Are you going to have children?
True. Yeah. And there are. I'm a liberal. I know a lot of conservatives. I grew up with conservatives. I still know a lot. I know a lot of liberals and conservatives doing this. There are cultural differences on almost everything. Yes, there are things that people sort to, but there is kind of a set: religion, guns, traditional family, etc. versus I don't want a car.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I need to get married or have a child. I'll get a loft in the city and etc. Kind of urban rural split. You've been awesome. I really appreciate you coming on. And again, thank you for pointing out Bill Bishop was not 100% correct. There's a lot of errors with it. What we're talking about is the general pattern he laid out, saying it goes back to 1990. Yeah. Is that true or is that not? And my personal feeling, and I can't prove it, is I've seen so many professors talk about hope. When I go, how do we fix this? And they go, well, I hope we can. I have a theory, can't prove it. People did not want to talk about Bill Bishop and the big sort, and they wanted to talk about gerrymandering and social media and extreme politicians because those are problems that can be easily solved. You can have laws to change the social media or change gerrymandering or remove elite politicians. You start talking about how it's the people themselves over 30 years doing it. That's not fixed by a simple legal change. That's hard cultural work that's going to require 200 to 300 million people and probably take a generation or two to fix. When you think about it like that, that's depressing, that's difficult, and it sounds like it's really difficult to fix. Can't we just pass a law to spank Facebook a little bit faster? Yeah. America, back on track. Humpty Dumpty put back together again. Okay, moving on, folks. Can't prove it.
No,
just a sentiment I get. You don't have to comment. Just something I want to put out there.
My theory. When I was a college student, to show you how old I am, I was a Soviet studies major.
Hey,
and one of the theories that we studied was that the Soviet Union was basically frozen, that there was no possibility of political change. And that what would happen, what it would take would be a demographic transition, basically a lot of people dying or retiring and new people coming up. And that's arguably what happened. If I look at Generation Z, if I look at people in their teens and their 20s right now, they are radically different from their elders in ways that we haven't really seen before. You were showing religion being non-controversial. One of the things that's interesting is ever since 2000, people under 30 have disaffiliated from religion at levels we've never seen in American history before, which is really amazing. I mean, this is the kind of thing people predicted in the U.S. 100 years ago, and it hasn't happened. So it's possible that once Generation Z ages out into becoming into leadership positions, right? Ages up into leadership positions, that we may see more homogeneity around this. The thing that worries me, though, and this is the big, I believe that climate change is the biggest challenge facing human civilization, and it's the deepest, it's the vastest challenge we've ever faced. I mean, we're looking at something like World War II plus the Industrial Revolution combined, right?
Mm,
And in the US right now, we are still bitterly divided about it in red versus blue terms.
thank you.
So I really worry about our approach to this. I worry that we are way too slow in taking steps, and parks were bogged down by people on the red side. And this may get very ugly. We've already seen people who do basic actions like stopping at people's SUVs or something, get threatened with major jail time. I wouldn't be surprised to see some kind of tit for tat, level of violence happening as we edge deeper into the climate crisis. Now, I know a interesting number of Republicans are actually changing their minds on this. If you look at Republicans under 40, they tend to accept climate change is happening. I've had conversations with very conservative Republicans who think climate change is happening. Humans aren't causing it. It's just happening. So they're going to adapt.
Yeah.
They're ready to adapt. If they're living on the sea coast, they're like, all right, this isn't a good place to live.
Yeah. Seen that.
But
Seen that.
in the meantime, at this critical stage of our decarbonization, I fear this is going to drag us down. So that's my big fear.
I appreciate that. We have to go. We got another interview. Would you ever be willing to come back?
I'd like that very much. It's a pleasure talking with you, Marcus. You have a great topic and a great manner. You're a really good interviewer. I'd be delighted to come back.
I will email you in a few hours a copy of this video, Professor. If you can think of anybody else who might be willing to be part of an honest conversation, we'd appreciate any recommendations. And we definitely want to have you back for a more deep dive on this.
Well, I like the sound of that. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and good luck. Keep up this great project.
I appreciate it. I'm going to email you soon. Please think of anybody else besides yourself who we may be able to reach out to. I deeply, deeply appreciate it.
Will do.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.